Hey everybody, welcome to our difficulty ranking for the bosses of the recent Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. We don't whip these videos out too often, but for high-profile releases that we care about, it's always worth running the extra mile, so to speak. As always, thank you to our patrons for helping sustain our livelihood. We appreciate it big time. Anyways, with all that said, let's get into the ranking.
Number 13, Ramina, Saint of the Bud. If we were to rank these bosses purely on the amount of time I spent fighting them, Ramina would be the easiest by a long shot. I actually managed to win on my second attempt, and for reference, I think R'hllana, Radahn, and Bale took me close to 1,000 combined attempts. While difficulty was clearly a focus of Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses, Ramina feels different. She feels like one of the woman on oversized animal bosses of the Dark Souls series, but modernized. Well, she is a woman on an oversized animal, and is modernized, but really, Ramina feels like a step back into the days of easy fun. When's the last time you fought a new boss like Pinwheel? I'm not saying Ramina is as easy as Pinwheel, but relative to the rest of the DLC, she is kinda. The Saint of the Bud has a lot of health, but also has minimal evolution over the course of her fight, meaning once you get down her first phase, you've got down her second phase. The only difference between the two is the minorly impactful Butterfly AoE, which would be a lot more troublesome if it inflicted Scarlet Rot like Ramina's staff did. Even then, I never found myself in danger of getting the Rot, and if you've explored the main game or Rao, you'll likely have an abundance of preserving boluses anyways. In my 2 attempts, I found that just standing next to Ramina completely neutralized her. She would often miss me when I was next to her, and as a bonus, being by her side renders all pincer and centipede attacks useless besides the spin, which is easy to dodge. Her most punishing move, the slam, also has an indicator right before she dives at you, making it a free move to avoid and counter once you catch that. Unlike almost every other boss in this DLC, Ramina gives you constant opportunities to attack her following her own attacks, does minimal damage, and never really progresses much over the course of her fight. Even though she's strikingly easy relative to the rest of the Remembrance bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, Ramina, Saint of the Bud is still fun and was a nice break from the difficulty.
Number 12, Miquella's Meat Riders. These jokers are like any other fight with a bunch of NPCs, but spicier because they're in the hyper-aggressive Elden Ring engine. It's not the bygone days of old, where you could just hold out a shield and circle someone around until you get behind them and one-shot them, miss that as I do. Instead, you gotta worry about things like ranging and positioning and movement and all that stuff that I don't like having to care about outside of actual bosses. Freya's jump attacks in particular can be a bit of a pain because it has the added property of dodging anything you sent out just prior to her leap. This humbled me many a time, although it's totally avoidable if you don't send out random R1s in neutral, and the fact that I have to use fighting game parlance to describe this encounter says enough. I'm awful at fighting games and not all that much better at FromSoft PvP, so I consider it an intermediate challenge.
Number 11, Erdtree Avatar. I can't explain how refreshing it was to fight a boss and see yellow on its health bar. Though, if you were to blend all 3 of Erdtree Avatar's phases into one big one, it probably wouldn't be yellow after you hit it. But besides the point, at least you don't have to worry about this being a grueling or boring endurance test. But this is still very much an endurance test. Erdtree Avatar, even with its longevity spread out over 3 phases, is one of the easier bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree. This is something Alex and I classify as a glass cannon boss. You do a lot of damage to it does a lot of damage to you. Luckily, it can't dodge, and you can, so advantage you. Erdtree Avatar's moveset gradually expands after each health bar, but none of its attacks are outright deadly besides the triple AoE, which can be easily avoided by moving out of its range, as in not being an idiot like a certain someone. Although you honestly should try to dodge the single AoE, you can nail it for half its health if you manage to. It's helpful that nearly all of Erdtree Avatar's attacks give you enough time to jump attack its head at least once, and sometimes during a long range move you can even hit its body if you get in close enough. And in one of my favorite mechanics of the entire DLC, if you riposte it after you empty its health bar, it'll respawn with 75% health in the next phase. The biggest things you want to capitalize on are the Avatar's head slams, especially the grab attack, as you can do nearly a full combo if you dodge it. In all, through a mixture of its fairly slow recovery speed coupled with its striking damage output, Erdtree Avatar is in that golden zone of difficulty that I find is most common with the fights in Dark Souls 3. I'm happy with how hard Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses are, but this is my ideal fight with regards to challenge.
Number 10, Metur, Mother of Fingers. The biggest shock to me was people's response to Metter's placement in our quality ranking. I knew it wasn't one of the more popular bosses, but people seemed to absolutely hate it or something. I hate to be that guy, I really do, but I seriously just didn't find her that hard or frustrating. She does have a move that is virtually undodgeable unless you have some specific weapon art, which is a bit insane, but it doesn't tend to kill you unless you are already low, so to me it's whatever. The basic moves she has are outright earnest by Elden Ring standards, with no particular delays or difficult to interpret combo endings to speak of. Maybe she'll slam her head into the floor one more time than you'd expect, but it's all well within the bounds of memorization ability. The only move I ever felt the need to annotate in my head with any sort of direction is to roll a bit later than you'd expect for the spinny whirligig move. In fact, if you roll backwards, which is usually a huge no-go, it can position you right next to her for a free charge attack or something else on the heftier side. Solid offensive opening if you pull it off. She definitely hits like a satellite laser. I'm not going to ignore that, literally in the case of one attack, but she has so many openings and such non-aggressive AI that I never found it too demanding to slink away for a heal or get my kicks in.
Number 9, Golden Hippopotamus. I really gotta refight this thing now, because nobody complains about it anymore. Even pre-nerf, I personally thought Golden Hippo was pretty easy, but I also was at a fairly high Scattletry level, at least compared to what Alex was at when he first fought this thing. By far the hardest part of this fight was the bite attack. Like Commander Gaius' now probably infamous rush attack, the window and hitbox Golden Hippopotamus's bite has are somehow longer than a near millisecond timed roll's iframes. Besides that, Golden Hippo's main form of trouble comes by way of delayed attacks, which will be a common theme among the next few bosses. It's a pretty tame gimmick once you get the timings down, but getting the timings down means dying at least a few times. He's also a surprisingly good greed checker, and an even better camera f***er. If the camera problem got fixed, I genuinely think this fight would be the easiest in the DLC. Once Golden Hippo enters Phase 2, his attack pool grows substantially, although none of his moves ever gave me a ton of trouble besides the roly-poly one. If you're a bitch vigor build like me, you won't get one-shot by any of this boss's heavier moves. From experience, Golden Hippo gets much easier with patience and caution, but it doesn't change the fact that it still has, or rather had, that grab attack. FromSoft's affinity for weird, roided out versions of animals that already exist on Earth strikes again, but at least you can come back at a higher Scattletry level rather than suffer at the likely lower levels you'll be at when you first reach Shadowkeep.
Number 8. Midra, Lord of Frenzied Flame. Midra is no pushover, don't get us twisted. He was knocking me around for about 45 minutes or so before I extinguished him for good. But it's one of those fights where once everything clicks into place, you feel like you've been baptized and reborn anew the next time you walk into that fog wall. Some observations I found really helpful in negating the more pesky moves of his. For starters, it is possible to dodge his Quasar explosion move, although I don't recall getting footage of me pulling it off. One way is to roll the moment he lands, and again like a second later for the second explosion. It's pretty tough to nail, but fortunately getting hit by it is rarely a big deal. The other way I've avoided it is just by running as far as possible and then trying to jump when the second explosion comes, not unlike how I avoid some of Radahn's super moves. As for his sword combos, they're not easy, but if you can recognize specific strings like the overhead stab that you roll back from and all that, it's manageable. Roll later than you expect for the fire, since it takes time to arrive, not unlike the Putrescent Knight's flames. He also staggers extremely easily, so adding Frostbite to anything will have him bent over your lap for half the fight if you play things aggressively. Don't mind the frenzy build-up much. I don't think that bar ever filled for me a single time while I was fighting him. If you do all this, I won't say he goes down easy, but you can have a fighting chance. He's one of the tougher bosses in the series as a whole, but in a monstrous work like this DLC, he's still only in the bottom middle end of the pack challenge-wise.
Number 7, Putrescent Knight. Putrescent Knight is like Golden Hippo, but more extreme. This has, as Alex said in our quality ranking, maybe the most bizarre timings to get down in the entire series. It's an interesting design choice, but I'm not here to discuss that. What it is hard as shit for about 30 minutes. Then, once you realize you can only attack him one at a time between his attacks, he gets a lot easier. Putrescent Knight is mainly a patience test, but he doesn't have a ton of health, so it's not a massive challenge. I also got incredibly lucky with my winning fight in that the thing got stuck in a loop of doing its basic combo for the entire first phase. His second phase, anyways, is pretty much phase 1 but with the easy to dodge fire attacks, which is pretty helpful. That first time he rises up in a giant goop pile is pretty deceptive. If you keep your greed in check and hold your rolls until you see the thing start to move, Putrescent Knight will go down surprisingly easy.
Number 6. Mesmer the Impaler. Mesmer is one of the most intuitive feeling bosses ever, which makes the challenge greatly lessened in my eyes. The first phase has nothing but spear moves, excluding the introductory fireball, which is easily avoided by dodging a bit after the shrinking circle closes in on Mesmer. As for the spear stuff, you pretty much just naturally get a feel for knowing what combo it is based on the first attack, or at least that's how it went for me. The grab is pretty much free. There are a couple of good ways to dodge it, but one way I've seen work pretty often is rolling instantly as soon as you notice it, and then spam rolling so the second roll avoids it. It costs a bit more stamina, but there are a decent amount of delayed moves that you can avoid that way, making it a handy thing to have in one's toolkit if you can't get down the normal timing. For me, the challenge almost solely comes from Phase 2, where he gets a host of hyper-delayed snake attacks that juke me out without fail. The single strike one isn't bad, but the triple combo and the Madras Whistle looking crazy super move both demand that you have some killer roll discipline that I was having trouble mustering. It's always the moves where someone basically pauses in place for a second and then does nothing, but suddenly accelerates into an attack at a gazillion miles an hour that gets me, since it's less reaction-based than rhythm or memory. You can't dodge it by looking and going, okay, I'm gonna dodge now. You have to have like a timer going in your head, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever. If that stuff is easy for you though, then Mesmer might be even less challenging for you than I. He's still a tough cookie for sure, but there are bigger threats to be found.
Number 5, Commander Gaius. This is where the difficulty scales up a notch. Like I briefly stated in Golden Hippo's segment, I felt like a lot of the easier fights in this DLC were around the Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne territory with difficulty. With Gaius, I'd say we enter the realm of the hardest main game bosses in Elden Ring and Sekiro, which on their own are leagues above any of the fights in the rest of the series. What specifically makes Gaius so difficult is, well, a lot of things. Good, bad, and ugly. The ugly is the rush attack. No explanation needed. I'm just not a fan of moves like this, although rolling through them is pretty good for boosting your confidence. The bad is two things, and first, his greed checking attack, the hind leg kick. Once again, to reiterate, I am a fan of bosses that punish overzealous attacking. I like it when a boss makes it hard for you to find openings to counter them, but partially why Gaius is so difficult is because of how sporadically he uses the kick. It often makes it so you can't attack him once he finishes a combo, while also allowing him to initiate a new combo. This is a difficulty ranking, so this isn't intended to be a complaint, nor is it. It's just the easiest way to explain why Gaius is somewhat difficult. I still managed to beat Commander Gaius in a bit under 45 minutes of fighting him, and that's mainly because I was so used to delayed attacks. Because that's the other kicker. His attacks are quite belabored, and will catch your rolls more often than not. If you can handle all of those though, he'll be alright. The good thing is that his Phase 2 provides more openings for you than his Phase 1, should you avoid the major attacks like the corkscrew, which I'd argue are actually easier to dodge than most of his board's generic slams, and his own attacks with his halberd, as their timings are guessable. The main thing to avoid is to simply not be static, as he has the gravity well and a plethora of moves that punish you for inactivity. In all, Gaius is a decent boss that's around the difficulty levels of Hora Lu or Moog Lord of Blood for me, which is pretty insane when you consider it only gets exponentially more difficult from here.
The strategy that ended up working best for me was poking him with the flame thrust weapon art attached to a greatsword, and otherwise pulling off cheeky heavy attacks while aiming for staggers. It's sort of an odd positioning heavy technique, but it saved me a lot of hassle, so I still vouch for it as a decent way to put him down. Number 4, Baal the Dread. One thing about this fight that makes it extremely not frustrating is that his head almost always ends up right in front of you when the combos end. Whoever is responsible for this at FromSoft needs a fruit basket, a blowjob, and a pay raise. I've fought my fair share of FromSoft dragons the same as anyone else watching this video, and the difference in fun is astonishing when you compare this to their earlier attempts at the formula. People have joked that Baal is to Midir what R'hllana is to Pontiff, and while I think the difficulty gap is a lot smaller in this case, I can see what they mean by it. I veered away from my usual choice of weapon, the Dryleaf Martial Arts, to give some use to the dedicated anti-dragon Great Katana that seems to have been made almost specifically for this fight. You can totally do without it, but having that kick-ass weapon art is so useful that it's hard for me to imagine fighting him any other way. A lot of Baal's moves are simple swipes and bites like any other dragon, at least to start, but he stands out in a couple ways. Firstly, he's the only dragon I can think of to not develop the bad habit of shooting fire at absolutely nothing for extremely long periods of time. I don't know why they all do this, but if you look back, it's a pretty observable trend, and it does answer a lot of questions about why dragons seem to be almost unilaterally extinct in every timeline they make. When he uses his fire breath, you actually have to keep rolling and not just jog out of the way. Secondly, once his AoEs get added to the mix in Phase 2, you need to get pretty good at iframing them to hang in there. It's especially hard to avoid the one that instantly follows his Flame Breath from the Sky move, since you're not likely to be staring at the ground, which functions as your cue for when to roll. If you spam roll, you're going to get caught after the second one, which is what happened to me a lot of the time before I figured this out. I opted to simply memorize the timing on a Mississippi count basis, but there's more than one way to skin a Drake. The Fireballs in the Air move that he likes to start Phase 2 with can be dodged by running diagonally, similarly to how you avoid Abretus' Call Beyond. I think the size of his Phase 2 exclusive moveset can make him a bit tough to learn since you're not exposed to everything right off the bat, and the timing on some of the AoEs is rough for sure. I'd call him the hardest dragon fight they've made bar none, although he falls just short of the top 3 as far as this full expansion goes.
Number 3, R'Lana, Twin Moon Knight. While I think if I were to fight R'Lana again, she'd be a lot easier, based on how long it took me to beat her, and the suffering I went through to get there, for me, R'Lana, Twin Moon Knight is the most difficult boss ever made. Though frankly, any of these top 4 could be anywhere on this list. I'd say they're 4 of the 5 hardest bosses in this series, with Malenia being the 5th. And R'Lana is essentially Malenia, but somehow harder. The most striking component to this boss is her aggression, which if you compare to one of the old hardest bosses of all time, like Orphan of Kos or Manus, R'Lana makes them look like they're fighting in slow motion. She also has a variety of combos that can stretch from 4 moves all the way to 8, and she can stop those combos at any point from move 4 to move 8. Because you're never fully certain when she'll stop attacking, in my experience, I didn't have full confidence in myself offensively at any point. This is all exacerbated in Phase 2 when many of her attacks gain follow-ups and the nice bonus of elemental damage on top of her insane physical damage. Not to mention, her biggest attacks have the capability to one-shot vigor-heavy builds and are decently hard to dodge anyways, especially when you're struggling with nerves near the end of a good fight. I think this boss was intended to be fought at a much higher Scadutree level than 5, which if you gather all the fragments up to Bellarat is where you'll be at. When I first made it to R'Lana, I actually had the Cerulean Coast Grace, but figured that I wasn't supposed to explore that area until later. Grave mistake. Luckily for me, only 11 hours later, over the course of 3 days, I finally beat the Sister of Rennala. Like I even needed Scadutree fragments. This not only solved my challenge fix, but completely removed that addiction. I was at my wit's end when I beat her, and the emotions that poured out of me were insane. I wasn't crying or anything, I was like making noises and jumping around. If a boss turns you into a Neanderthal when you beat it, that should be an indication as to how unbearably difficult it is. R'Lana, Twin Moon Knight is for me the hardest boss ever created, and it scares me to death that the next time FromSoft releases something, there will likely be as hard as this one.
Number 2, Divine Beast Dancing Lion. This thing just has so much health, seriously, it's ridiculous. It's an endurance fight if there ever was one, with plenty of windows to heal unmolested and a correspondingly deep health pool for the big guy. If you don't know how to dodge every move in this fight, inside and out, don't even bother. You'll get worn down far before you start to win any kind of DPS test if you're regularly getting nailed by everything he does. Even before the elemental moves enter the fray, you have to get over the trap of attacking him from behind, which is a pretty good policy for almost every other boss, except this one. Here, you'll only get a free Wisdom Tooth removal kick for your troubles. Instead, you have to stay frontside and earnestly dodge everything head-on with perfect timing. Once the elements get tossed into the mix, ice is by far the nastiest of the 3. While lightning can be tough to deal with if you walk into an off-screen bolt by accident, ice is all around full of strange timings and tough to read lead-ups. The wind mode, on the other hand, is gracious enough to add basically nothing other than a fodder tornado move. It isn't really punishable, but the only thing getting caught in that are bugs and floating dust particles, so whatever. I dread getting to this fight at rune level 1, because all of this stuff is probably just flat out instant death, save for maybe the spinny vomit move, which isn't too bad. A lot of people say the camera is rough if you lock on as well, but I didn't really have issues with it myself. I mostly remember my struggles with this fight because my mom really wanted me to go upstairs and watch House of the Dragon with her and my stepdad, and I told her to give me one more attempt, and I actually won that time, which was kinda awesome. Sometimes pressure makes diamonds, they say.
Number 1, Promised Consort Radahn. You know a boss is beyond difficult when it goes repeatedly viral for just being hard. Promised Consort Radahn is the closest thing I can compare in gaming to an extreme demon from Geometry Dash, which Alex and I both believe is the hardest game ever made. The amount of practice, memorization, failure, and ultimately relief that goes into this boss is unparalleled across the series, and unsurprisingly, the trial and error experience I had is pretty much universal. I haven't heard anybody online say Radahn is even kind of hard. He's unanimously agreed to be the hardest boss Miyazaki and his evil team of lab rats have come up with so far. To me, FromSoft bosses are starting to develop like Hot Ones sauces, where the upper extreme of the bell curve is so far beyond the average now that anything harder, or to stay with the analogy, anything hotter, becomes incremental and almost for bragging rights. This DLC in my mind has pretty much reached the bedrock of fair but still challenging boss design. Hopefully. I'm not trying to fight something as hard as this again. The one thing about Promised Consort Radahn is that he has an exact solution to everything he does, because in fairness he is pretty stationary, unlike, say, Rilana or Orphan of Kos. So in theory he's very beatable, it's just putting it into practice that's the hard part. Obviously. I gave a pretty simple and frankly efficient breakdown of his moveset and how you should react to it in the quality ranking, but essentially there is a set of attacks you can't counter and a set that you can counter. I think trying to break down this fight's difficulty is kind of inane, because everybody knew what the #1 spot was going to be. You don't need some nerd online to tell you, especially if you've experienced it yourself. Promised Consort Radahn is both an incredible and incredibly difficult boss fight that, for the moment, is the pinnacle of challenge across the From Software Souls games.
One interesting observation I want to add is that Dadel, one of our patrons you might have noticed and a fellow ranking maker guy, has noticed that using guard counters with shields absolutely devastates Radahn more than pretty much any non-cheesy strategy. I haven't tested it much because I have an allergic aversion to one-handing weapons outside of Dark Souls 1, but if any of you guys are still getting a rough time from the big guy, you should give that a shot and see how it goes. Jack also told me that the crystal tier that buffs your damage like Power Within from Dark Souls 3 is absolutely busted to the point of him intentionally not using it. So, if you want a nuclear option, go find the Furnace Golem with that one and punch his ankles a few times. See how that goes. Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. We'll be continuing our series on the Souls bosses, so make sure to tune in for the next few parts of that down the road. That's all for now. Deuces.